Even the gods have abandoned that useless trinket girl." Sister Marin's words cut through the morning silence, like shards of broken glass, each syllable designed to remind Lyra exactly where she stood in the temple hierarchy. Nowhere. Lyra felt the familiar sting settle in her chest, that hollow ache she had learned to carry like a stone. She kept her head down as she continued polishing the marble altar, her rough cloth moving in careful circles around the base where the moonfire relic sat in its eternal mocking silence. The cracked crystal orb caught the dawn light streaming through the stained glass windows, its fractured surface throwing rainbow patterns across her worn hands, beautiful and utterly powerless. 20 years, Sister Marin continued, her voice dripping with the particular cruelty reserved for those who had never known kindness themselves. 20 years you've tended that broken thing, and what has it given you? What has it given any of us? She gestured dismissively at the relic, her silver robes rustling with authority Lyra would never possess. The moonfire relic was supposed to be the temple's greatest treasure, a conduit to the ancient powers. Instead, we're left with a glorified paperweight and a foundling who thinks polishing it makes her important. The other sisters tittered behind their hands, the sound like wind chimes in a storm. Lyra had heard this song 1,000 times before. She was the girl with no family, no bloodline, no gift beyond an inexplicable devotion to something everyone else had written off as worthless. The temple had taken her in as an infant, left on their doorstep with nothing but a note claiming she was meant to serve the relic. Meant to serve, not meant to use, not meant to commune with, not meant for anything greater than endless futile maintenance. "Perhaps," came High Priestess Valeria's voice from the doorway, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "our dear relic keeper would prefer to find purpose elsewhere? The kitchens always need another servant. The stables could use someone to muck out the horse stalls." Her pale eyes, cold as winter moonlight, fixed on Lyra with the calculating stare of a predator sizing up prey. "Surely there are more productive ways to serve the temple than this." Lyra's fingers stilled on the altar's surface. She had been having this conversation in various forms since she was old enough to understand that her position was both essential and utterly without respect, the keeper of the moonfire relic. It sounded important, almost mystical, until you realized the relic had been broken for longer than anyone could remember, and all the position really meant was that you got blamed for its continued failure to perform miracles. "The relic is my responsibility," Lyra said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned long ago that speaking loudly only invited more attention, more cruelty, more detailed explanations of exactly why she was a disappointment to everyone around her. "My duty." Duty! High Priestess Valeria stepped into the sanctuary, her ceremonial staff clicking against the stone floor with each precise step. "Tell me, child, what duty requires you to speak to broken crystal as if it might answer? What duty has you spending hours staring into its cracked depths as if you might divine some hidden truth?" Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed her. Conversations with the relic. Late at night, when the temple grew quiet and the other sisters retreated to their chambers, she would sit before the altar and whisper to the silent crystal. Not prayers exactly, but something deeper. Questions about who she really was, where she had come from, why she felt so inexplicably drawn to this broken thing that everyone else dismissed. Sometimes, in those quiet moments, she could have sworn the relic pulsed with warmth beneath her fingers. Sometimes the cracks in its surface seemed to shift, to reform into patterns that looked almost like recognition. But she had never told anyone about those moments, had barely allowed herself to believe they were real. "I was foundling brought here to serve the relic," Lyra repeated the explanation she had been given her entire life, the words worn smooth by repetition. "This is my purpose." "Purpose?" Sister Marin laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Child, your purpose is whatever we tell you it is. You have no bloodline, no gifts, no calling beyond what charity we've shown you. The relic doesn't need a keeper. It needs to be retired to some dusty storage room where broken things belong." But as the words left Sister Marin's mouth, something stirred in Lyra's chest. A flicker of heat, of defiance, of something that felt dangerously close to rage. She pressed her palm flat against the altar's surface, directly beside the relic's base, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, she felt it respond. The faintest pulse of warmth, like a dying ember suddenly given breath. "The relic," she said, her voice stronger now, "isn't broken." The sanctuary fell silent. Even the dust motes seemed to pause in their lazy dance through the morning light. High Priestess Valeria's eyebrows rose slowly, her expression shifting from dismissive contempt to something that might have been dangerous interest. "Excuse me?" Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs, but she couldn't take the words back now. "It's not broken," she repeated, her hand still pressed against the warm marble. "It's waiting." "Waiting." Sister Marin's voice was deadly quiet. Waiting for what exactly? Lyra looked up at them then, these women who had raised her and tormented her in equal measure, who had given her shelter and made sure she never forgot it was charity. For the first time in her life, she held their gazes steadily. "I don't know," she said truthfully, "but something is coming." The moonfire relic exploded like a dying star. Silver fire erupted from the cracked crystal as Lyra's awakened power finally shattered the last of the suppression barriers. 20 years of contained magic blazing free in a cascade of starlight that turned the temple sanctuary into something that belonged in legends. The ancient walls rang with harmonics that hadn't been heard since the first wolf queens walked the earth, and every wolf within 50 miles felt the call in their bones. Their true queen had returned. But it was Lyra herself who commanded attention as she rose from the ruins of her prison, power crackling around her like a living crown. Her transformation was complete now, no longer the partial shift triggered by combat, but the full manifestation of what she had always been meant to become. Silver fur rippled along her arms, not covering her humanity but enhancing it, marking her as something beyond ordinary wolf or human understanding. Her eyes blazed with golden fire, ancient and terrible and infinitely beautiful, holding depths of magic that could reshape kingdoms or reduce them to ash. When she moved, starlight seemed to follow in her wake, and her very presence made the air itself bow in recognition of royal blood awakened. "Impossible!" High Priestess Valeria's voice was barely a whisper as she stood in the sanctuary doorway, her face white with shock and something that might have been terror. Behind her crowded the other sisters, their expressions ranging from awe to disbelief as they witnessed the resurrection of a bloodline they had believed extinct. "Not impossible," Lyra said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ancient stones sing in response. "Just hidden, suppressed, kept from becoming what I was born to be by people who feared what wolf queens represented." Her golden gaze swept the assembled witnesses, cataloguing fear and recognition in equal measure. "But I am hidden no longer." The great doors burst open with enough force to rattle the hinges, and Seraphina swept into the sanctuary like winter given human form, her pale hair streaming behind her and her eyes blazing with fury that could have frozen blood. Behind her came a dozen of her personal guards, weapons drawn and faces set with the grim determination of soldiers prepared to die for their cause. "Kill her!" Seraphina commanded, her voice sharp as breaking glass. "Kill her now, before—" The words died in her throat as her gaze fell on Lyra, taking in the silver fire that danced around her form, the royal markings that blazed along her skin like living tattoos, the crown of starlight that seemed to hover just above her brow. This wasn't the powerless foundling she had tried to eliminate. This was something far older and infinitely more dangerous. "Before what, Lady Seraphina?" Lyra asked with dangerous quiet, taking a single step forward that somehow carried the weight of advancing armies. Before the Wolf Queen reclaims her birthright, before the daughter of Queen Lunara rises to take back what was stolen. Another step, and silver fire blazed higher around her form. Before you answer for the murder of my parents and 20 years of imprisonment. Your parents were traitors, Seraphina spat, but there was uncertainty creeping into her voice now, the first cracks in the perfect confidence she had worn like armour. They threatened the stability of the realm, defied the natural order that keeps kingdoms from tearing themselves apart. The noble houses acted to preserve. The noble houses acted to steal power they had never earned, Lyra interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word, magic weaving itself through her tone until it carried the authority of absolute command. My mother was the rightful queen, descended from bloodlines that predate your upstart families by centuries, and you murdered her for the crime of being born to rule what you wanted to steal. The sanctuary filled with otherworldly light as her power continued to grow, no longer constrained by crystal prisons or careful hiding. Every wolf in Kael's retinue was responding to her presence, their beasts pressing against human consciousness with desperate recognition. Their queen had returned, and instincts older than civilization demanded acknowledgement. "My lady," one of Seraphina's guards said nervously, his weapon trembling in his grip as ancient magic pressed against his consciousness. "Perhaps we should—" "Stand your ground," Seraphina commanded, but her voice lacked its usual steel. She was beginning to understand that she had awakened something beyond her ability to control, something that made her political schemes look like children's games played with wooden toys. "You don't understand what you're facing, do you?" Lyra said, and now her smile was sharp as winter moonlight, beautiful and deadly and utterly without mercy. "You see the foundling you tried to poison, the servant you attempted to frighten into exile. But look at me now, Seraphina. Really look, and tell me what you see." The truth was written in silver fire and golden eyes, in the way every wolf in the sanctuary had dropped to their bellies in instinctive submission, in the ancient magic that made the very air taste of power and royalty and justice too long delayed. This wasn't just a wolf queen. This was the Wolf Queen, the culmination of bloodlines that had shaped the world when the current noble houses were nothing but ambitious merchants and minor lords. "I see a threat that must be eliminated," Seraphina said, but her words rang hollow now, bravado masking the growing understanding that she had made a terrible miscalculation. "Then eliminate me!" The challenge hung in the air like lightning waiting to strike. Around the sanctuary, witnesses held their breath as two queens faced each other across 20 years of suppression and betrayal, across bloodlines that had been at war since the Night Queen Lunara died screaming in flames. Seraphina's hand moved to the blade at her hip, but the weapon remained in its sheath. Not from mercy or hesitation, but from the dawning recognition that steel and mortal strength were meaningless against something that commanded the very elements themselves. "You can't," she whispered, and for the first time since entering the sanctuary, her perfect composure cracked entirely. The prophecies, the old warnings, they said the wolf queens would never rise again. "Prophecies," Lyra repeated, her voice soft with dangerous amusement. "You mean the ones your ancestors helped write, designed to keep my bloodline suppressed, the convenient predictions that claimed wolf queens were extinct and would never return?" She laughed, the sound like silver bells and breaking chains. "Did you really think ancient magic would stay buried forever simply because you wished it so?" The power around her flared brighter, and now everyone in the sanctuary could see the truth written in light and legend. The royal markings that blazed along her arms, genetic tattoos that appeared only in the purest bloodlines, the way shadows bent away from her presence, recognizing something that commanded even darkness itself. The crown of starlight that wasn't metaphor, but literal manifestation of a queen's awakened authority. "I am Lyra of the ancient bloodline," she said, her voice carrying across the sanctuary and beyond, reaching every corner of the temple complex and echoing in the bones of every wolf who heard it. Daughter of Queen Lunara, heir to the Wolf Queen throne, and mate to the Alpha King who stands beside me. Her golden gaze found Kyle where he watched from the sanctuary's edge, and the mate bond blazed between them like molten gold made visible. I reclaim my birthright, my crown, and my place in this world that tried so hard to erase me. The words rang with the finality of destiny fulfilled, of suppressed power finally claiming its rightful expression. Around the sanctuary, those who had witnessed her awakening fell to their knees, not from fear, though that was present in abundance, but from the bone-deep recognition that they stood in the presence of true royalty for the first time in 20 years. Seraphina alone remained standing, her face white as winter frost and her eyes wide with the understanding that everything she had planned, every scheme she had woven, every alliance she had built was crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. The Wolf Queen had risen again, and her enemies would learn what it meant to face the fury of a bloodline that had ruled when their ancestors were nothing but shadows in history's margins. The mating ceremony began at sunset, when the sky burned gold and crimson like the fires of ancient magic awakening. They gathered in the temple's great courtyard, transformed from a simple stone space into something that belonged in the age of legends. Silver flames danced in bronze braziers that had been brought from the temple's deepest vaults, artifacts that had waited centuries for a Wolf Queen's return. The air itself seemed to shimmer with power, charged with the electricity that came from witnessing history reshape itself in real time. Lyra stood at the courtyard's heart, no longer the foundling servant who had polished altars and endured mockery. The Wolf Queen's regalia had manifested around her like starlight given form, a crown of silver fire that seemed to hover just above her brow, robes that moved with their own wind, jewellery that pulsed with the rhythm of her heartbeat. She was radiant, terrible, beautiful enough to stop hearts and start wars. Beside her, Kyle waited in his ceremonial armour, black steel inlaid with silver that caught and reflected her otherworldly light. The Alpha King's presence was overwhelming as always, but now it harmonised with hers instead of overshadowing it. Two powers that had been meant to rule as equals, finally coming together as their bloodlines had intended from the beginning of time. "This is madness," High Priestess Valeria whispered from the crowd of witnesses, but her protest lacked conviction. The assembled nobles and temple officials had all felt it, the shift in the world's balance, the way reality itself seemed to bend around the mated pair. Ancient laws were reasserting themselves, older than political arrangements and stronger than mortal schemes. "This is justice," Elder Thane corrected, his weathered face bright with satisfaction as he watched the ceremony unfold. He had waited 20 years for this moment, had tended gardens and kept secrets and protected a hidden queen until she was ready to claim her birthright. "This is what should have been from the beginning." Seraphina stood frozen at the courtyard's edge, her perfect composure finally shattered completely. The political marriage that was supposed to secure her family's power was dissolving before her eyes, replaced by something she couldn't manipulate or control or destroy. The Wolf Queen's mate bond trumped every human law, every political necessity, every carefully crafted alliance. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with desperate authority. "The treaty with the Southern Reach, the alliance our kingdoms need for survival. You would destroy it all for the sake of an impossible bond." "The bond is not impossible," Lyra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ancient stones sing in response. "It simply required the right blood to awaken it." She extended her hand to Kyle, silver fire dancing between her fingers as power called to power. "The Alpha Kings and Wolf Queens ruled together for 1,000 years, before your families decided they deserved crowns they had never earned. Tonight, that partnership is reborn." Kyle took her hand without hesitation, and the moment their skin touched, light blazed between them like a sun being born. The mate bond, no longer hidden or suppressed, revealed itself in its full glory, golden fire that wrapped around them both, binding them with chains forged of starlight and destiny. "I, Kyle of the Northern Kingdoms, Alpha King, and heir to the throne of wolves, claim you as my mate," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Not from political necessity, not from strategic advantage, but from recognition of the bond that makes us whole. I, Lyra of the ancient bloodline, Wolf Queen and daughter of Queen Lunara, claim you as my equal," she replied, power blazing around her like a visible aura. "Not as subject to king, not as lesser to greater, but as queen to king, as mate to mate, as the other half of a soul that was split at the world's creation." The words rang with ancient authority, with magic that predated human law and mortal politics. Around the courtyard, every wolf present felt the bond complete itself, felt the rightness of it settle into their bones like recognition of something that had always been true. But Seraphina was not finished. With the desperate fury of someone watching their entire world collapse, she played her final card. "The war!" she snarled, her beautiful face twisted with rage and desperation. "Without the Southern Reach Alliance, your precious kingdom will fall to the shadow armies within days. You would sacrifice thousands of innocent lives for your selfish desires." "The shadow armies," Lyra said softly, turning to face Seraphina with eyes that blazed like golden suns, "that your family helped create. The dark magic that was supposed to make the Southern Reach indispensable, forced the Northern Kingdoms to accept your terms." Her smile was sharp as winter starlight, beautiful and deadly, and utterly without mercy. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize the magical signature? Wolf Queens were trained to detect corruption, Seraphina. I can smell your family's treachery from 100 miles away." The accusation hit the courtyard like a thunderbolt. Gasps arose from the assembled witnesses as the implications settled. The Southern Reach hadn't just been offering alliance against the shadow threat. They had been controlling it, manufacturing the crisis that made their political marriage a necessity. "Lies," Seraphina breathed, but her denial lacked conviction. The truth was written in her face, in the way her supporters began backing away as understanding dawned. "Shall I prove it?" Lyra asked, raising her hand toward the southern horizon. Silver fire blazed around her fingers as she reached out with senses that could detect magical corruption across vast distances. "Shall I show everyone what your family has been feeding? What darkness you've been nurturing to make yourselves indispensable?" The power she unleashed was like nothing anyone had ever witnessed. Silver light exploded outward from her position, racing across the landscape faster than thought, seeking the source of the corruption that had been plaguing the southern border. When it found its target, the magical backlash was visible even from the temple courtyard, a pillar of black flame that erupted on the horizon, followed by screams that carried on the wind as the shadow armies found themselves suddenly, violently cut off from their power source. "The war," Lyra said into the stunned silence that followed, "is over. The shadow threat has been eliminated, along with the traitors who created it." Her golden gaze fixed on Seraphina with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Your usefulness, Lady Seraphina, has come to an end." But Seraphina had one last desperate gambit. With the fury of someone who had lost everything, she drew a blade that gleamed with unnatural darkness, lunging toward Lyra with killing intent written in every line of her body. She never reached her target. Kyle moved faster than mortal eye could follow, his own sword singing from its sheath to meet Seraphina's attack. But it was unnecessary. The Wolf Queen's power simply incinerated the corrupt blade before it could come within arm's reach, reducing Seraphina's final weapon to ash and memory. "Guards!" Kyle commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Escort Lady Seraphina to the border. She is banished from the northern kingdoms, never to return on pain of death." His pale eyes were ice cold as they fixed on the woman who had tried to murder his mate. "Consider it mercy that I don't execute you where you stand." As Seraphina was led away, her perfect composure finally broken completely, her schemes reduced to ashes, the mating ceremony continued. But now it was more than just the union of two individuals. It was the restoration of an ancient balance, the return of a partnership that could reshape the world. "By the old laws and the new," Elder Thane pronounced, stepping forward to officiate the ceremony with authority that came from bloodlines older than any political appointment. "By the recognition of wolf and human, by the blessing of magic itself, I pronounce you mated in the eyes of all who witness." His ancient voice carried across the courtyard with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The Alpha King and the Wolf Queen, rulers united, balance restored. The golden light of the mate bond blazed brighter, wrapping around them both like a living crown, and when they kissed, the very air sang with the harmony of powers meant to be joined. Around the courtyard, witnesses fell to their knees in recognition of true royalty, of the partnership that would usher in a new golden age. The Wolf Queen had risen. The Alpha King had chosen his equal. And together they would rule with the wisdom of ancients and the strength of legends reborn. 6 months after the mate bond completed, Lyra stood on the palace balcony overlooking a kingdom transformed. The morning sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and green, illuminating fields that bloomed with impossible abundance, forests where ancient magic had awakened after centuries of slumber, cities where wolves and humans lived in harmony that hadn't been seen since the first age of kings and queens. The Wolf Queen's return had brought more than political change. It had restored the very land itself, healing wounds that ran deeper than memory. "You're thinking too hard again," Kyle said, joining her at the stone railing with the silent grace that had made him legendary on battlefields. His arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest, where she fit as if she had been created for exactly this position. The mate bond hummed between them, no longer desperate or painful, but warm and constant as a heartbeat, a golden thread that connected them across any distance. "I'm thinking about her," Lyra replied, leaning into his warmth as her hand moved instinctively to rest on the slight curve of her belly. "About what she'll inherit, what kind of world we're building for our daughter." Their daughter. The heir who would carry both Alpha King and Wolf Queen bloodlines, who would be born into a world where ancient magic had been restored and the balance of power finally set right. The pregnancy had manifested 3 months ago, with all the ceremony befitting royal blood, silver light dancing around Lyra's form, every wolf in the kingdom feeling the stirring of new life, prophecies awakening that spoke of a golden age born from the union of equal powers. "She'll inherit strength," Kyle said with quiet certainty, his hand covering hers where it rested on their unborn child. "She'll inherit wisdom. She'll inherit a kingdom where she never has to hide who she is or pretend to be less than what she was born to become." The truth of it settled around them like a blessing. Below in the courtyard, Elder Thane worked in gardens that now bloomed year-round, tending plants that grew with magical vitality under the Wolf Queen's influence. The old temple had been transformed into a school where young people with awakened bloodlines learned to control and celebrate their gifts, rather than suppress them. High Priestess Valeria had been replaced by teachers who understood that power was meant to be nurtured, not feared. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyra asked softly, watching a group of children practice shifting in the training yards, young wolves whose transformations came easier now that magic flowed freely through the land. "The political complications, the noble houses we had to bring to heel, the alliances we had to rebuild from scratch." Kyle's laugh was warm against her ear. Do you mean, do I regret finding my mate, watching you become the queen you were always meant to be, ruling beside the most powerful woman in the kingdom's history? His arms tightened around her, and she could feel his smile in the way his bond signature brightened with affection. Ask me something difficult next time. She turned in his arms to face him, studying the man who had chosen love over duty, who had shattered political arrangements and rebuilt an entire kingdom around the simple truth that some bonds were too strong to deny. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, premature aging from the stress of kingship, but he wore it like a crown that made him more beautiful rather than less. I spent 20 years believing I was nothing, she said, her voice soft with wonder that still struck her at unexpected moments. 20 years accepting that I was broken, worthless, a foundling who should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness the world threw my way. Her hands framed his face, thumbs tracing the familiar lines of cheekbones she had memorized during countless nights of learning what it meant to be loved completely. And then you walked into that temple and looked at me like I was everything. You were everything, he corrected, his pale eyes serious as death. You just didn't know it yet. The foundling was a lie, Lyra. The worthless servant was a disguise. You were always a queen. You just needed the right moment to remember how to wear the crown. The words wrapped around her heart like a warm embrace, healing wounds she hadn't realized were still tender. The journey from invisible temple keeper to acknowledged wolf queen hadn't just been about reclaiming power. It had been about reclaiming worth, about learning that the voice that had whispered you are nothing for 20 years had been wrong from the very beginning. The Relic chamber, she said, suddenly remembering. We never did anything with the space where the moonfire crystal used to sit. I've been waiting for you to decide what should go there, Kyle replied. It's your space, your choice. What do you think should mark the place where the Wolf Queen broke free of her chains? She considered the question, thinking of the cracked crystal that had been both prison and protection, both curse and eventual salvation. The suppression had been cruel, but it had also kept her alive long enough to become strong enough to survive her own awakening. Perhaps that was worth acknowledging. A memorial, she said finally, not to the suppression, but to survival, to the idea that sometimes the thing that seems like it's destroying you is actually preparing you for something greater. She smiled, feeling the rightness of the decision settle in her bones. For everyone who's ever been told they're nothing, who's ever believed the lies others tell about their worth. Perfect, Kyle agreed, and she could feel his approval through the bond like warm sunshine. Queen Lyra's memorial to the hidden strength? Queen Lyra. The title still sent a thrill through her, not because of the power it represented, but because of the acknowledgement it carried. She was not a pretender or an upstart. She was the rightful heir to a bloodline that had shaped the world, finally claiming her birthright after 20 years of enforced obscurity. A knock at the balcony doors interrupted her thoughts, and Captain Marcus appeared with the easy informality that had developed since the political restructuring. The old guard had adapted surprisingly well to serving a mated pair of rulers who actually shared power instead of just giving lip service to the concept. "Your Majesties," he said with a bow that was respectful without being obsequious, "the morning reports. The harvest yields are up another 15% in the eastern provinces. Apparently the soil itself is responding to the magical restoration. The southern border remains quiet with no signs of renewed corruption. And," his expression grew amused, "we've received another dozen marriage proposals from noble families hoping to arrange matches with any hypothetical future siblings our heir might have." "Hypothetical future siblings?" Lyra laughed, the sound bright as silver bells. "She's not even born yet, and they're already planning to use her family for political advantage?" "Some things never change," Cale said dryly, "though I notice they're being much more polite about their scheming these days. Fear of being incinerated by an annoyed wolf queen does tend to improve people's manners. Marcus observed with the careful neutrality of someone who had watched his queen reduce enemy armies to ash with a gesture. They discussed the morning's business, trade agreements that needed royal approval, judicial decisions that required the Wolf Queen's magical insight, infrastructure projects that would benefit from enhanced soil fertility. It was the routine work of ruling, made easier by the fact that their combined powers had eliminated most of the kingdom's pressing problems, and their partnership meant difficult decisions could be shared rather than shouldered alone. When Marcus departed, they returned to their comfortable silence at the balcony railing. The kingdom spread out below them like a living map, prosperous and peaceful in ways that seemed almost miraculous after the chaos of war and political upheaval. "Do you think she'll be happy?" Lyra asked, her hand moving again to rest on her growing belly. "Our daughter. Do you think we can give her the childhood I never had, the certainty that she's loved and wanted and worth everything good the world has to offer?" "I think," Kale said, his voice warm with absolute conviction, "that she'll be the most loved child in the kingdom's history. Not because she's an heir, not because of the power she'll inherit, but because she's ours, because she's wanted, planned for, celebrated before she's even born." His hand joined hers on her belly, and she could swear she felt a flutter of response from within. She'll grow up knowing exactly who she is and exactly how much she's worth. The sun climbed higher, painting the kingdom in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere in the distance she could hear children laughing in the training yards, could sense the contentment of wolves running free in the restored forests, could feel the pulse of magic flowing through the land like a river returning to its proper course. "When I stopped believing I was worthless," she said softly, the words carrying 20 years of pain transformed into hard-won wisdom. "When I finally understood that the voice telling me I was nothing was lying, that's when everything changed. Not when I gained power, not when I found magic, but when I realized I had always been worth loving." "Always," Kyle agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple that carried all the devotion of a man who had found his perfect match. "You were always worth everything, my queen. The world just needed time to catch up." They stood together in comfortable silence, two rulers who had found their way to each other across impossible odds, watching over a kingdom that had been reborn through their love. The Wolf Queen and the Alpha King, partners in power and equals in every way that mattered, building a future where their daughter would never doubt her worth or hide her strength. The story that had begun with cruelty and suppression had ended with love and recognition. The foundling who was told she was nothing had become the queen who was everything. And in the growing life she carried, the next chapter was already beginning. A child who would inherit not just power and position, but the unshakable knowledge that she was loved beyond measure and worth beyond calculation. Sometimes the most profound magic wasn't in the spells you could cast or the powers you could wield. Sometimes it was simply in learning to see yourself as worthy of the love you had always deserved. The ground trembled before they heard the hoofbeats. Lyra felt it first through the soles of her bare feet, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. She paused in her morning cleaning ritual, her cloth suspended halfway to the relic's surface, and listened to something that sounded like thunder rolling across a clear sky. "What in the goddess's name?" Sister Marin's voice trailed off as the great doors of the temple burst open with enough force to rattle the ancient hinges. He filled the doorway like a force of nature given human form. Alpha King Kyle strode into the sanctuary with the kind of presence that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. 6.5 feet of raw power wrapped in black leather and steel, his dark hair still wine-tossed from the ride, his pale eyes scanning the sacred space with the calculating intensity of a predator assessing new territory. Behind him came his war party, 20 of the fiercest warriors in the northern kingdoms, their weapons gleaming and their wolves prowling restlessly at the edges of consciousness. Lyra had never seen an Alpha King before, but she knew instantly what he was. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, making her wolf, her poor, suppressed, barely there wolf, whimper and press against the inside of her ribs. The very air seemed to thicken with dominance, with the kind of authority that bent the world to its will through sheer force of existence. High Priestess Valeria appeared as if summoned, her ceremonial robes hastily arranged, but her composure perfect. She swept into a deep curtsy, her silver hair gleaming in the morning light. "Your Majesty," she breathed, her voice honey-sweet with the kind of deference reserved for those who could destroy you without breaking stride. "What an unexpected honour! How may the Temple of the Moonfire serve the Northern Throne?" Kyle's gaze moved past her as if she were merely another piece of furniture, scanning the sanctuary until it landed on the altar, on the relic, on Lyra, frozen beside it with her cleaning cloth still clutched in one trembling hand. "The Moonfire Relic," he said, his voice carrying the kind of command that had led armies into battle and emerged victorious. "I need it." "Of course, Your Majesty, of course." Valeria's laugh was like silver bells, bright and brittle. "Though I'm afraid, that is, the relic has been dormant for some time. Generations, actually. We've maintained it faithfully, naturally, but as for its legendary powers—" She gestured helplessly at the cracked crystal orb. "Perhaps there's something else the temple could offer? Our healing sisters are renowned throughout the kingdom. Our library contains texts dating back—" "I need the relic." Kyle stepped closer to the altar, and Lyra found herself backing away instinctively, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "The reports from the southern border grow worse each day. Dark magic, creatures that shouldn't exist. An enemy that seems to draw power from shadow itself. The old texts speak of the Moonfire as a weapon against such forces." "Yes, Your Majesty, but—" "Show me." The command was directed at Lyra. She blinked, certain she had misheard. Alpha Kings didn't speak to temple servants. They barely acknowledged the existence of anyone below the rank of High Priestess. But he was looking directly at her, those pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her knees threaten to buckle. Your Majesty, I don't—" She glanced desperately at Valeria, hoping for rescue, but found only barely concealed irritation. "You tend the relic," Kyle said, and it wasn't a question. "Show me what it does." "It doesn't do anything," Sister Marin interjected quickly, shooting Lyra a warning look. "That's what we've been trying to explain. The girl is devoted, certainly, but the relic has been powerless for—" "I wasn't speaking to you." The words hit Sister Marin like a physical blow, cutting off her explanation mid-sentence. The temperature in the sanctuary seemed to drop several degrees as Kyle's attention returned to Lyra. "Your name?" "Lyra," she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again. "Lyra, Your Majesty." Something flickered in his expression when she spoke her name. A frown, as if he were trying to remember something important that danced just beyond his grasp. His wolf stirred again, pressing more insistently against his consciousness, and for a moment his control wavered enough that she could feel the edge of his beast's attention like a physical weight. "Lyra." He said her name, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. "Show me." She wanted to explain that there was nothing to show, that the relic was just a broken crystal that hadn't responded to anyone in living memory, that she was nobody special despite what she had claimed the day before. But something in his eyes, a kind of desperate hope wrapped in kingly command, made her nod instead. With trembling hands she reached for the Moonfire relic. The moment her fingers made contact with its surface, the world shifted. Heat flooded up her arms, not the gentle warmth she sometimes felt during her private moments, but a surge of power that made her gasp aloud. The cracks in the crystal seemed to pulse with silver light, faint but unmistakable, and for just an instant the sanctuary filled with the scent of moonflowers and magic. Then it was gone, leaving only the ordinary broken crystal and Lyra swaying on her feet. But Kyle had seen it. His eyes were wide, his wolf pressing so hard against his consciousness that she could almost see it in the depths of his gaze. When he looked at her now, it wasn't with the casual attention of a king addressing a servant. It was with recognition. Impossible, Valeria breathed, but Kyle wasn't listening to her anymore. He stepped closer to Lyra, close enough that she could smell leather and steel and something wilder underneath. Close enough that his power wrapped around her like a living thing, making her suppressed wolf respond with a desperate yearning whine. "Again," he said softly, and this time it wasn't a command. It was a plea. The sanctuary emptied like water through a broken dam. High Priestess Valeria's sharp dismissal sent the sisters scurrying from the sacred space, their whispered speculations fading into the corridor's shadows. Even the Alpha King's war party retreated beyond the great doors, leaving only the echo of their presence and the lingering scent of steel and leather. Lyra stood alone with the most powerful man in the northern kingdoms, her heart beating so violently she was certain it would shatter her ribs. "Again," Kyle repeated, his voice softer now but carrying an undertone that made her wolf press desperately against the cage of her consciousness. "Touch the relic again." She glanced toward the doors, half hoping Valeria would return and put an end to this impossible moment. But the sanctuary remained empty, except for dancing dust motes and the weight of ancient stone watching their every breath. "Your Majesty, I don't think—" "Kyle?" The correction came swift and sure. "When we're alone, you'll use my name." The presumption of it should have been shocking. Kings weren't addressed by their given names, especially not by foundling servants who ranked below novice sisters in the temple hierarchy. But something in the way he said it, the way his pale eyes held hers with an intensity that felt like drowning, made her nod instead of protest. "Kyle," she whispered, and watched something flicker across his expression like recognition of a half-remembered melody. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scars along his jawline, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the exact shade of silver in his eyes. Close enough that his presence wrapped around her like a physical force, making her suppressed wolf whine with something that felt dangerously close to longing. "The relic responded to you," he said, "and it wasn't a question. Not just now, but before. That's why you said it wasn't broken." Heat flooded her cheeks. Sometimes I think I feel something, but—" "Show me." Her hands trembled as she reached for the moonfire relic again. The cracked crystal sat in its ancient setting like a broken heart, its fractured surface catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the altar. She had touched it thousands of times over the years, but never with someone watching who might actually understand what happened when she did. The moment her palms made contact, power surged through the connection. This time the light was stronger, silver fire dancing along the crystal's broken edges like liquid starlight. The air filled with the scent of moonflowers and something wilder, older, more primal. Magic hummed through the sanctuary's bones, making the ancient stones sing with harmonics that hadn't been heard in generations. And in that moment of impossible radiance, something snapped into place between them. The mate bond hit like lightning striking the earth. Lyra gasped, her hands flying away from the relic as golden light exploded behind her eyes. Every nerve ending in her body blazed with recognition, with a connection so profound it felt like her soul had been torn in half and suddenly, violently made whole. The sensation wrapped around her heart like molten gold, binding her to the man standing 3 feet away with chains forged of starfire and destiny. Kale staggered backward, one hand pressed to his chest, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been terror. "Impossible," he breathed, but his wolf was surging against his consciousness now, pressing so hard against the barriers of his control that she could see it in the depths of his gaze. Wild, desperate, claiming, mate. The word echoed in her head, and she did not know if it came from her wolf or from the ancient presence still examining her, or from him. Mate, 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 like a prayer or a curse or both. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, because the golden thread connecting them was growing stronger with every heartbeat, weaving itself through her bones until she wasn't sure where she ended and he began. "The mate bond." Cale's voice was hoarse with strain, his control hanging by gossamer threads. You're... He shook his head as if trying to clear it, but his eyes never left her face. "This can't be happening. I don't understand." "Neither do I." He dragged his hands through his hair, pacing away from her only to find himself drawn back like iron to a magnet. "You're a temple servant, a foundling with no bloodline, no pack, no... But my wolf knows you, recognizes you as if she belonged to him, as if she always had." The golden thread pulled taut between them, and when she took an instinctive step forward, his entire body went rigid. "Don't," he said roughly, "don't come any closer." But even as he spoke, his own feet carried him toward her, closing the distance until only a breath separated them. This close, she could see the war raging in his expression, duty battling instinct, logic fighting magic, a king's responsibilities crushing against a wolf's desperate need. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm bound by treaty to marry Lady Seraphina of the Southern Reach. The alliance is crucial for the war effort, for the kingdom's survival. Whatever this is between us..." "I know." The words came out steadier than she felt. "I know who you are, what you owe your people. I'm nobody, you're Kyle, I'm nobody." Something dangerous flashed in his silver eyes. "Don't." "It's true. I have no family, no bloodline, nothing to offer a king or his kingdom. Whatever this feeling is, it doesn't matter." His hands framed her face before she could finish, long fingers threading through her hair with desperate gentleness. "You are not nobody," he said fiercely, his forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "Whatever else happens, whatever impossible choices we face, you are not nobody. Do you understand me?" The mate bond blazed between them, golden fire in her veins, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. There was only this, the connection that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, the recognition that sang in her bones, the certainty that she had been created for this man, and he for her. Then reality crashed back in like cold water. "The war," she whispered, "your marriage, the kingdom." "I know." His thumbs traced her cheekbones, his touch reverent and desperate. "I know." They stood there, in the dancing light of the still glowing relic, caught between destiny and duty, between the impossible and the inevitable. The mate bond hummed between them like a living thing, beautiful and terrible, and utterly, completely doomed. But what neither of them realized was that the relic had been waiting for this moment for 20 years, and now that the connection was finally made, ancient magic long held in check was beginning to wake. She arrived like winter incarnate. Lady Seraphina of the Southern Reach swept through the temple's outer courtyard with a retinue of 50 mounted guards, her silver-white hair streaming behind her like a banner of conquest. Even from the sanctuary's high windows, Lyra could see the predatory grace in every movement, the kind of lethal beauty that made men start wars and kingdoms fall. The Alpha King's intended bride had come to claim what was hers. "Goddess preserve us," Sister Maren breathed from beside Lyra at the window. "She's even more beautiful than the stories claim." Beautiful was too small a word for what Seraphina was. She moved with the fluid power of someone born to rule, her riding leathers perfectly fitted to showcase a figure that belonged in sculptures and legends. Her pale eyes swept the courtyard with calculating intelligence, missing nothing, cataloguing every potential threat or advantage with the instincts of a born strategist. When those eyes turned toward the sanctuary and seemed to find Lyra's face in the window, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "She'll want to see the relic, of course," High Priestess Valeria's voice carried up from the courtyard as she hurried to meet their distinguished guest. His Majesty was quite interested in its current condition. "I'm sure he was," Seraphina replied, her voice carrying easily across the stone courtyard. It was a voice like honey over steel, sweet enough to draw you close and sharp enough to cut when you arrived. Though I confess I'm more interested in understanding exactly what has captured the Alpha King's attention so thoroughly that he's remained here for 3 days instead of returning to prepare for our wedding. The words hit Lyra like physical blows. 3 days. She had been so lost in the impossible discovery of the mate bond that she hadn't considered how her extended private sessions with Kyle might look to the outside world, how they might look to his intended bride. "Your ladyship is too gracious," Valeria simpered. "His Majesty's dedication to the war effort is legendary. I'm certain his delay here has nothing to do with the foundling girl who tends the relic." Seraphina's interruption was silk-wrapped poison. "The one he's been requesting private audiences with? Oh, priestess, I may be many things, but naive is not among them." Lyra's hands tightened on the windowsill until her knuckles went white. Of course Seraphina knew. A woman who had survived the brutal politics of the Southern Reach to become its most powerful noble didn't miss details, like a king spending hours alone with a servant girl. "Perhaps," Seraphina continued, her voice carrying a note of dangerous amusement, "I should meet this remarkable keeper who has proven so educational for my intended." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Lyra found herself scrubbed, rebraided, and dressed in her one decent robe before being presented in the sanctuary like an exhibit in a museum. She stood beside the altar while Seraphina examined both her and the relic with the kind of thorough attention usually reserved for livestock at market. "So you're the one," Seraphina said finally, circling Lyra with predatory grace. "The little temple mouse who's been playing with powers beyond her understanding." "I serve the relic as I was sworn to do," Lyra replied carefully, keeping her eyes downcast. The mate bond hummed beneath her skin, a constant golden thread connecting her to Kyle, even though he wasn't in the sanctuary. She could feel his tension, his awareness of Seraphina's presence, the war between duty and desire that raged in his chest. "Sworn?" Seraphina laughed, the sound like silver bells with broken edges. "By whom? You're a foundling child. You have no family to swear you to service, no bloodline to grant you authority over ancient artifacts. You're here by charity, nothing more." Each word landed with surgical precision, designed to remind Lyra exactly what she was, and more importantly, what she wasn't. Not noble, not powerful, not worthy of an Alpha King's attention. "The relic responds to her," Valeria said nervously, clearly hoping to deflect some of Seraphina's dangerous focus. "Perhaps that grants her some measure of—" "Does it?" Seraphina's pale eyes fixed on Lyra with predatory interest. "Show me." It wasn't a request. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for the moonfire relic, but this time, with Seraphina's calculating gaze weighing her every movement, the connection felt different, hostile. The golden warmth that usually flooded through her when she touched the crystal flickered weakly, as if something were blocking the flow of power. The relic remained stubbornly dark. "How fascinating," Seraphina murmured. "It seems your pet foundling's gifts are rather inconsistent, priestess. Perhaps His Majesty's interest was misplaced after all." Humiliation burned in Lyra's chest, but beneath it was something more dangerous. The mate bond stretched between her and Kyle like a taut wire, and she could feel his approach before his boots echoed in the corridor. Could sense the moment he appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with those pale silver eyes. "Seraphina." His voice was perfectly controlled, the tone of a king greeting an ally. But Lyra could feel the tension beneath it, the way his wolf prowled restlessly behind his careful composure. "You made good time from the Southern Reach." When one's intended husband lingers over long at a remote temple, one finds motivation to travel swiftly. Seraphina moved to him with fluid grace, her hands settling on his chest with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "I confess I was curious about what could hold the great Alpha King's attention for so long." Kyle's eyes found Lyra's over Seraphina's shoulder, and the mate bond flared between them like a struck match. The connection blazed so bright that she gasped aloud, her hand flying to her chest as golden fire raced through her veins. Seraphina's head turned slowly, following Kael's gaze to where Lyra stood, frozen beside the altar. When her pale eyes settled on Lyra's face, her expression shifted into something that might have been understanding, or calculation. "Ah," she said softly, and there was nothing sweet in her voice now. "I see." The temperature in the sanctuary seemed to drop several degrees. "You will pack your things tonight," Seraphina said, addressing Lyra directly for the first time since her examination. Her voice was conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "You will leave the temple before dawn, and you will not return. The roads are dangerous for a young woman travelling alone, but I'm sure someone with your resourcefulness will find a way to manage." "Seraphina," Kael started, but she silenced him with a look. "Or perhaps," she continued, still watching Lyra with those calculating pale eyes, "you would prefer to remain and see what becomes of foundling girls who reach too far above their station. I'm told the Southern Reach has some fascinating customs regarding the punishment of servants who forget their place." The threat was crystal clear, wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile that promised suffering. Lyra looked at Kael, saw the war raging in his expression, the impossible choice between the woman he was bound to marry and the mate his soul recognized as its other half. "I understand," Lyra whispered, and meant it. She was nobody, just as she had always been told. Whatever magic lived in the mate bond, whatever power flowed between her and the relic, it wasn't enough to overcome the brutal reality of politics and bloodlines and the survival of kingdoms. But as she turned to leave the sanctuary, as she felt the mate bond stretch and strain with the distance, Seraphina's voice followed her like a blade between the shoulder blades. "Oh, and little foundling, if I discover you've remained anywhere in the northern kingdoms after tonight, I'll ensure your disappearance becomes permanent. I do hope I've made myself clear." Perfectly clear. Lyra fled the sanctuary with the sound of Seraphina's laughter ringing in her ears and the golden thread of the mate bond screaming in her chest like a wound that would never heal. She found him in the forgotten garden where moonflowers bloomed despite the frost. Elder Thane had been the temple's groundskeeper for longer than anyone could remember, so ancient and weathered that he seemed more tree than man, his gnarled hands eternally stained with soil and his back bent from decades of tending things that grew in sacred ground. Most of the sisters forgot he existed, treating him as part of the landscape, another fixture of stone and root that required no acknowledgement or courtesy. Lyra had always been kind to him, perhaps because they shared the same invisibility, the same relegation to the temple's forgotten corners. Now, as she stumbled through the garden paths, with her meagre possessions clutched in a canvas sack, tears streaming down her face, and the mate bond howling in her chest like an open wound, he appeared from the shadows as if summoned by grief itself. "Child." His voice was rough as bark, worn smooth by age and sorrow. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Elder Thane noticed everything that happened in the temple grounds, saw things others missed or chose to ignore. Of course he would know about Seraphina's ultimatum, about the impossible choice that had torn her world apart in the span of a single conversation. "I have to." The words came out broken, fractured by the sobs she could no longer contain. "She'll kill me if I stay, and Kael, the Alpha King, he can't. The kingdom needs his marriage, needs the alliance. I'm nobody, Elder Thane. I'm nothing." Nothing. The old man studied her with eyes the colour of deep forest shadows, ancient and knowing, and infinitely sad. "Is that what you believe?" "It's what everyone believes. It's what I am." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, but fresh tears kept coming. "A foundling with no bloodline, no family, no gifts worth noting. The relic responded to me sometimes, but tonight it wouldn't even—" "The relic wasn't responding to you, child." Thane's interruption was gentle but firm, and something in his tone made her look up through her tears. "It was calling to you. There's a difference." "I don't understand." He was quiet for a long moment. His weathered face turned toward the temple's ancient spires where lamplight flickered in Seraphina's borrowed chambers. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of secrets held for too long. "Your parents didn't abandon you on the temple doorstep, Lyra. I brought you here myself 20 years ago, carrying you through these very gardens while enemy soldiers burned the summer palace and hunted the last of the royal bloodline." He turned to face her fully, and in his ancient eyes she saw a grief that had been carefully tended for 2 decades. "Your mother died protecting you. Your father fell defending the throne that should have been yours by right of birth." The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation shattering another piece of the story she had been told about herself, about where she came from, about who she was supposed to be. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Something deep inside her, some part that had always felt displaced and yearning, was beginning to sing with recognition. "The last Wolf Queen," Thane continued, his voice soft with reverence. "Queen Lunara of the ancient bloodline, the Silver Wolves who ruled alongside the first Alpha Kings. She was your mother, child. And when the noble houses conspired to destroy her line, when they decided that Wolf Queens had grown too powerful, too threatening to their carefully ordered world, she made sure her daughter would survive." "The Relic," Lyra breathed, understanding beginning to dawn like sunrise over a battlefield. "Not a relic, a prison." Thane's expression hardened with ancient anger. "The Moonfire Crystal was created by the court mages to contain your bloodline power, to keep you hidden, suppressed, unremarkable. Every day you tended it, every time you touched its surface, it was draining your heritage, keeping you weak enough to hide among foundlings and servants." Her legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the frost-covered earth, her canvas sack falling forgotten beside her as the magnitude of the deception crashed over her like a wave. 20 years of believing she was nothing. 20 years of accepting cruelty and dismissal as her natural lot. 20 years of tending the very thing that kept her from becoming who she was born to be. "The noble houses," she said numbly. "They know?" "Some suspect. The oldest families remember the prophecies, remember what wolf queens were capable of. Power over all wolves, not just their own beasts. Magic that could heal or destroy with equal ease. The ability to command elements themselves when roused to fury." Thane knelt beside her, his ancient hands gentle on her shoulders. "Your mother could call lightning from clear skies, child, could speak to every wolf in the kingdom and have them answer. The current noble houses exist because they destroyed that power, and they would do anything to keep it from returning. Including murder. Especially murder." His voice was grim. "Lady Seraphina's bloodline descends from those who betrayed your mother. She knows exactly what you are, even if you don't. That's why she moved so quickly to eliminate you, why she couldn't risk letting you stay near the Alpha King." The mate bond. Of course. An Alpha King mated to the last Wolf Queen would shift the balance of power in ways that threatened every carefully constructed alliance, every political arrangement that kept the current noble houses in control. "Kyle doesn't know," she said, and it wasn't a question. "The suppression was too complete. Even his wolf couldn't sense what had been hidden so thoroughly. But now that the bond has formed..." Thane's eyes grew distant, calculating. "The connection will work both ways. Your power will start breaking through the barriers, and his presence will accelerate the process." As if summoned by his words, she felt it, a flutter of something vast and wild stirring in her chest, pressing against walls that had contained it for 20 years. Not her wolf, which had always been there in its suppressed state, but something far older and more dangerous, magic that tasted of moonlight and silver fire, of authority that could make kingdoms kneel and enemies flee in terror. "The relic," she said again, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "If it's destroyed..." "The suppression ends." Thane's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Your power returns. The Wolf Queen rises again." His expression grew serious. "But child, once that door is opened, it cannot be closed again. You would become a target for every enemy your mother ever made, every noble house that profited from her death. The Alpha King's political marriage would be the least of your concerns. She thought of Kyle, felt the golden thread of their connection stretching taut with distance and desperation. Thought of Seraphina's threats, of the war brewing in the south, of a kingdom balanced on the knife's edge between survival and destruction. If I stay hidden, she said slowly, if I run like she wants me to, the Relic continues to suppress my power. Kyle marries Seraphina for the alliance. The kingdom survives. And the last Wolf Queen dies forgotten, just as her enemies planned. But if the suppression breaks, you become who you were born to be. The Alpha King finds his true mate, and every enemy of the crown discovers that the bloodline they tried to destroy has returned to reclaim what was stolen. The choice hung between them like a blade, beautiful and terrible and sharp enough to cut the world in half. Behind them, the temple bells chimed midnight, marking the end of Seraphina's deadline and the beginning of whatever came next. Lyra closed her eyes and felt her mother's blood singing in her veins, felt the power that had been caged for 20 years pressing against its barriers with increasing strength. When she opened them again, Elder Thane was watching her with something that might have been pride. "Tell me," she said quietly, her voice steadier than it had been in hours, "exactly how one goes about destroying a suppression crystal." But as Lyra learned the truth about her past, as she began to plan her transformation from victim to queen, neither she nor Thane noticed the shadow that detached itself from the garden wall and slipped away into the night. Seraphina had always been thorough in her intelligence gathering, and she had not survived the brutal politics of the Southern Reach by leaving potential threats to chance. The Wolf Queen's daughter was planning to rise from her cage of lies, but her enemies would be ready. The poison came disguised as kindness. Sister Maren appeared at dawn with a tray of bread and honeyed tea, her expression softer than Lyra had seen in years of shared temple service. "You must be hungry, child," she said, settling the wooden tray on the small table beside Lyra's narrow cot. "I know last night was difficult. Perhaps some breakfast will help you think more clearly about your situation." Lyra had not slept. She had spent the dark hours wrestling with Elder Thane's revelations, feeling the truth of them settling into her bones like recognition of a half-remembered song. Wolf Queen, royal bloodline, 20 years of suppression designed to keep her hidden, powerless, safe. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, a weight that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully, studying Maren's face for signs of deception. But the older woman's expression remained gently concerned, motherly in a way that felt both foreign and desperately welcome. "I've been thinking," Maren continued, settling into the room's single chair with practiced ease. "Perhaps there's another solution to your predicament with Lady Seraphina. The temple has connections, places where a young woman might find sanctuary until this unfortunate situation resolves itself." Sanctuary. Lyra's hand moved instinctively toward the tea, then paused. Something in Maren's tone, a particular careful emphasis on the word, made her wolf stir uneasily in her chest. "What kind of sanctuary?" "The convent of Silent Mercy, beyond the eastern mountains. The sisters there have taken a vow of eternal silence and seclusion. No one would think to look for you there, and Lady Seraphina would have no cause to pursue a woman who had effectively removed herself from the world entirely. The eastern mountains, 3 weeks' hard travel through terrain that would kill the unprepared, to a place where she would be as good as dead to everyone who had ever known her, where the mate bond would stretch and thin until it snapped entirely, leaving Kyle free to marry Seraphina without the complication of an inconvenient connection to a foundling servant." "You've thought this through very carefully," Lyra observed, her hand still hovering over the teacup. The liquid was the perfect golden brown of honey and herbs, aromatic steam rising in delicate spirals that should have made her mouth water. Instead, her enhanced senses, sharper now since the bond had formed, more attuned to danger, detected something else beneath the sweet fragrance, something bitter and medicinal that made her newly awakening power recoil in warning. "I only want what's best for you," Maren said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice that made the deception all the more cruel. "You've served the temple faithfully for 20 years. You deserve peace, safety, a chance at a quiet life away from all this political turmoil." Lyra lifted the cup to her lips, letting the poisoned steam touch her tongue while her awakening bloodline analysed the threat with preternatural clarity. Nightshade, carefully measured to cause convulsions that would mimic a seizure. Enough to kill, but slowly, with symptoms that would suggest natural illness rather than murder. In the chaos that followed, her body could disappear, be quietly buried in the temple grounds with a story about tragic sudden illness and no questions asked. Seraphina's hand in this was invisible, but unmistakable. The perfect political solution: eliminate the inconvenient foundling before she could become a larger problem, with no trace leading back to the Southern Reach princess who would soon be queen. "Peace does sound appealing," Lyra murmured, and took what appeared to be a careful sip. The poison touched her lips, slid across her tongue, and met the rising tide of Wolf Queen blood that had been stirring all night in response to Thane's revelations. The reaction was immediate and violent. Her bloodline rejected the toxin like fire-consuming paper, burning it away before it could reach her stomach. But the process sent shockwaves through her system, her suppressed power surging against the barriers that had contained it for 20 years. Magic blazed through her veins like liquid silver, and for a moment her eyes flared with the golden light of her true heritage before she managed to force the display back under control. Sister Maren saw none of it. She was too focused on watching for the first signs of the poison taking effect, her expression shifting from false concern to anticipatory satisfaction as she waited for Lyra to begin convulsing. "The tea tastes strange," Lyra said weakly, letting her voice take on the breathless quality of someone fighting unexpected illness. "I feel dizzy." "Oh dear." Maren leaned forward with predatory interest disguised as worry. "Perhaps you should lie down, child. Sometimes sudden stress can affect the stomach." Lyra allowed herself to sway, one hand pressed to her forehead as if fighting nausea. In truth, she was fighting something far more dangerous, the surge of ancient power that wanted to incinerate everything in a 50-foot radius, starting with the woman who had just attempted to murder her. Her mother's blood sang with rage, with the fury of queens who had been betrayed and daughters who had been hunted. For a moment the Wolf Queen's power pressed so hard against her consciousness that she could taste silver fire, could feel lightning crackling at her fingertips, ready to reduce Sister Maren to ash and memory. But revealing herself now would be suicide. Seraphina was too clever, too well prepared. She would have contingencies in place, backup plans to ensure that even if this assassination attempt failed, others would succeed. Better to let her enemies believe their poison had worked, to let them think the foundling girl had died as quietly and unremarkably as she had lived. "I think," Lyra gasped, letting herself slide from the chair to the floor with carefully choreographed weakness. "I think something's wrong." "Don't try to move," Maren said, and now there was nothing false about the satisfaction in her voice. "I'll fetch help. Just rest now, child. Let the pain go." She swept from the room, no doubt rushing to inform Seraphina that the problem had been resolved, that the inconvenient foundling would soon be nothing more than an unfortunate memory. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. Lyra lay still for several heartbeats, listening to Maren's footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she rose smoothly to her feet, her body humming with power that no poison could touch, her mind crystal clear with the kind of dangerous focus that came from surviving an attempt on your life. The Wolf Queen's daughter had just received her first lesson in the politics of survival. Her enemies thought she was weak, thought she was helpless, thought she would die as quietly as she had lived. They were about to discover how wrong they were. But first she needed to reach Kyle. The mate bond blazed between them like a beacon, carrying her terror and rage across whatever distance separated them. She could feel his answering fury, his desperate need to reach her, the way his wolf was clawing at his control with the knowledge that his mate was in mortal danger. She staggered toward the window, letting her movements appear weak and uncoordinated for any watching eyes, while her enhanced senses mapped every shadow, every potential threat in the courtyard below. The sunrise was painting the temple stones gold and crimson, beautiful and terrible as the blood of queens. By the time Sister Maren returned with witnesses to discover the body, Lyra would be gone. But the poison attempt would not be forgotten, and neither would the woman who had delivered it with a smile. The war reports arrived with the dawn, carried by ravens whose wings bore frost and desperation in equal measure. Kyle stood in the temple's war room, a hastily converted chamber where ancient prayer scrolls had been replaced by military maps and tactical assessments, reading dispatches that grew more dire with each unfolded parchment. The southern border had fallen, 3 fortified positions overrun in a single night by creatures that defied description, led by an enemy that seemed to command shadow itself. "Your Majesty," General Marcus said grimly, pointing to the red marks that dotted the map like drops of blood. "At this rate of advance, they'll reach the capital within a fortnight. We need the Relic's power, and we need it now." The Moonfire Relic sat on its ancient pedestal in the centre of the chamber, transported from the sanctuary at Seraphina's suggestion that it might respond better in a proper military environment. It remained as stubbornly inert as ever, its cracked crystal surface reflecting nothing but ordinary light, mocking them with its continued silence. Kyle had been trying to activate it for 2 hours. His hands pressed against the fractured orb, his will focused with the same intensity that had won him a dozen battles, his wolf prowling beneath his skin with frustrated energy. Nothing. The ancient artifact might as well have been a piece of decorative stone for all the power it yielded to his touch. "Perhaps," Seraphina suggested from her position beside the tactical table, her voice honey-sweet with false concern, "the relic requires a different approach. The old texts speak of blood sacrifice, of pain offered willingly to ancient powers." "No." The refusal came out harder than Kale had intended, his wolf reacting violently to any suggestion that might cause harm to... To what? The relic? Or to the woman whose blood had proven capable of awakening it? The mate bond stretched between him and Lyra like a golden thread, carrying echoes of her emotions across whatever distance separated them. This morning, that thread sang with tension, with fear and determination tangled together in ways that made his beast pace restlessly behind his ribs. Something had happened, something that had filled his mate with the kind of deadly purpose that preceded either triumph or disaster. "The foundling girl," he said quietly, the words tasting like necessity and betrayal on his tongue. "Send for her." Seraphina's expression didn't change, but he caught the flicker of something dangerous in her pale eyes. "Your Majesty, surely you don't still believe that superstitious nonsense about the servant having some connection to—" "Send for her." This time his voice carried the full weight of kingly command, the authority that had united the northern kingdoms under his rule and would brook no argument from anyone, including his intended bride. General Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, I sent a man to fetch her an hour ago. The temple sisters say she's indisposed. Some kind of sudden illness that came on during the night." The mate bond flared with alarm, golden fire racing through Kale's chest as his wolf surged against his control. Illness. His mate was sick, possibly dying, and he was standing in a war room playing politics while she suffered. What kind of illness? The words came out as a growl that made every man in the room step back instinctively. "Convulsions, Your Majesty? High Priestess Valeria believes it may be some form of temple fever brought on by the stress of recent events." Kyle was moving before the general finished speaking, crossing the chamber in 3 swift strides toward the door. Behind him he heard Seraphina's sharp intake of breath, heard her calling his name with something that might have been panic, but his wolf was in control now, and the only thing that mattered was reaching his mate. He found her in the garden sanctuary, sitting beside a fountain where moonflowers bloomed impossibly in the morning light. She was alive, whole, so radiantly healthy that his entire body sagged with relief. But when she looked up at his approach, her eyes held shadows that hadn't been there before. "You're not ill," he said, and it wasn't a question. "No?" Her voice was steady, but he could smell deception on her, could sense the careful way she held herself as if secrets were hidden in every line of her body. "I'm not ill. The relic." He settled beside her on the stone bench, close enough that their bond hummed with shared warmth, close enough that his wolf finally stopped its frantic pacing. "I've been trying to activate it for hours. The war grows worse by the day, and I can't—" He dragged his hands through his hair in frustration. "I can't make it respond the way it does for you." Something flickered in her expression, understanding perhaps, or a decision being made. When she spoke, her words carried a weight that suggested she knew far more than a temple servant should. "It's not responding to me, Kyle. It's responding to what I am. I don't understand." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers trailing in the fountain's clear water as if seeking courage in its depths. When she looked at him again, her eyes held the kind of truth that changed everything. "I'm not a foundling. I'm not nobody. She took a breath that seemed to draw power from the air itself. "I'm the last of the Wolf Queen bloodline, the daughter of Queen Lunara, hidden here for 20 years, while the Relic suppressed my power to keep me safe from the noble houses who murdered my parents." The words hit him like physical blows, each revelation reshaping everything he thought he knew about the woman beside him, about the connection between them, about the relic that had remained stubbornly silent to his royal blood but blazed to life at her foundling's touch. Wolf Queen, the legendary bloodline that had ruled alongside the first Alpha Kings, that commanded power over all wolves and wielded magic that could reshape kingdoms. They had been extinct for 20 years, destroyed in the political upheaval that had brought the current noble houses to prominence. Except they hadn't been extinct at all. "Show me," he said, his voice hoarse with wonder and dawning understanding. She rose from the bench with fluid grace, moving toward the fountain's centre, where morning light danced on the water's surface. When she placed her hands just above the liquid, it began to glow with soft silver radiance, responding to her presence with the kind of easy magic that should have been impossible for anyone without royal blood. "The relic isn't broken," she continued, her voice growing stronger as power flowed around her like a visible aura. "It was created to contain me, to keep my abilities suppressed until I was old enough to control them. But the mate bond—" She looked at him with eyes that now blazed with golden light. "The mate bond is breaking the barriers faster than anyone anticipated." Understanding crashed over him like a tide. "That's why Seraphina wanted you gone. That's why she moved so quickly to eliminate you." His wolf snarled with fury at the thought of anyone threatening his mate, but beneath the rage was a growing sense of awe. "You're not just my mate, you're my equal. If the suppression breaks completely—" Her hands moved in complex patterns over the fountain water, and the silver light intensified until the entire garden blazed with otherworldly radiance. "If I become what I was born to be." The implications staggered him. A mated pair of Alpha King and Wolf Queen would wield power that hadn't been seen in centuries. They could end the war in the south, could reshape the political landscape, could rule together as their ancestors had in the golden age of the kingdoms. But they could also destroy every carefully balanced alliance that kept the realms stable, could threaten every noble house that had profited from the Wolf Queen's extinction, could become targets for assassination attempts that would make Seraphina's current machinations look like children's games. "The choice is yours," Lyra said softly, reading the conflict in his expression with the accuracy of their shared bond. "I can leave, let the suppression hold, let you marry Seraphina for the alliance your kingdom needs, or, her smile was sharp as winter starlight, beautiful and dangerous and utterly without fear. Or we destroy the relic tonight, break the suppression completely, and see what happens when the Wolf Queen rises again. The fountain water blazed higher, silver fire reaching toward the morning sky, and in its light she looked like exactly what she was, not a foundling servant, but a queen who had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reclaim her birthright. Above them, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, responding to the surge of ancient magic awakening after 20 years of enforced sleep. The choice hung between them like lightning waiting to strike, beautiful and terrible and capable of changing everything. In the distance, he could hear Seraphina calling his name, her voice sharp with barely concealed panic. She had felt the power surge too, had recognized the signature of magic she thought she had helped destroy 2 decades ago. The political marriage that was supposed to secure his kingdom's future had just become a trap that could destroy them all. But beside him sat his mate, his equal, the woman whose true nature could save or damn everything he had spent his life protecting. The mate bond blazed between them like molten gold, and for the first time since the war began, Kyle felt something that might have been hope. The words hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge, beautiful and terrible and sharp enough to cut the world in half. You can't. Kyle's voice was raw, with something that might have been anguish, his hands framing her face with desperate gentleness, even as his wolf howled for her to choose power, to choose him, to choose the bond that burned between them like molten gold. The alliance with Seraphina, without it, the kingdom falls to the southern invasion. Thousands will die. And with it, I die. Lyra's words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. She's already tried to poison me once, Kyle. Do you think she'll stop now that she knows what I really am? Do you think she'll let the Wolf Queen bloodline survive long enough to threaten her political marriage? The truth of it settled in his chest like ice. Of course Seraphina wouldn't stop. A woman who had orchestrated the murder of a foundling servant wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a rival queen, especially one whose very existence made her own position untenable, and with the relic still suppressing Lyra's power, she remained vulnerable to assassination attempts that wouldn't even require supernatural means. "There has to be another way," he said desperately, his forehead pressed against hers, breathing the same air while the mate bond stretched taut between them like a wire under terrible pressure. "Some compromise, some solution that doesn't force us to choose between love and duty." "Listen to yourself." Her laugh was broken, fractured by tears that reflected the silver light still dancing around her fingers. "You're an alpha king, Kyle. You know there's no compromise between survival and extinction, no middle ground between who I was born to be and who they forced me to remain." Her hands covered his where they rested against her cheeks, and her touch burned with emerging power. "The only question is whether I die as nobody or live as who I really am. If you break the suppression, every enemy your mother ever made will come for you. Every noble house that profited from the Wolf Queen's extinction will see you as a threat that must be eliminated. You'll have a target on your back that will never disappear. And if I don't, I'll die quietly in whatever corner Seraphina decides to hide my body, and you'll marry a woman who murdered your mate for political convenience." Her voice grew stronger, more certain, silver fire beginning to dance in her eyes. "Tell me, my king, which future do you think I should choose?" The endearment hit him like a physical blow, carrying all the love and longing and impossible hope that the mate bond had woven between them. My king. As if he belonged to her as much as she belonged to him, as if they were already the mated pair they were born to be, instead of 2 people caught between destiny and disaster. "I can't ask you to risk everything for me," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, his wolf was snarling in protest. His beast knew what it wanted: mate, queen, equal, partner. The animal side of his nature had no patience for political calculations or noble sacrifices. "You're not asking, I'm choosing." Her smile was fierce, feral, touched with the kind of dangerous beauty that had once made wolf queens legendary. "I've spent 20 years believing I was nothing because that's what everyone told me I was. But you know what I realized, sitting in that garden fountain with power flowing through my veins like liquid starlight?" He waited, caught in the blazing certainty of her gaze. "I was never nothing. I was everything they feared I could become." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "And I'm tired of being afraid of my own strength." The mate bond flared between them, golden fire racing through his chest as her power called to his, as Wolf Queen magic recognized its perfect match in Alpha King authority. For a moment he could see it, the future they could build together, the kingdom they could rule as equals, the golden age that could rise from the ashes of political arrangements and noble compromises. But he could also see the cost. The war that would come as displaced noble houses fought to maintain their stolen power, the blood that would be spilled as old enemies emerged from the shadows, the target that would be painted on both their backs from the moment her true identity became known. If we do this," he said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of kingship and all its terrible responsibilities, "there's no going back. The moment you break that suppression, the moment you become who you really are, everything changes. The political landscape, the balance of power, the very future of the kingdom. I know. Serafina will try to kill us both. I'm counting on it. The noble houses will unite against us. Every family that built their power on your mother's grave will see us as a threat that must be eliminated. Good." Her smile was sharp as winter moonlight, beautiful and deadly, and utterly without fear. "Let them come. Let them all come and discover what happens when they threaten a mated pair of true royalty." He stared at her, this woman who had been hidden in plain sight for 20 years, who had endured mockery and dismissal and attempted murder without breaking, who was now offering to risk everything for a love that defied every political calculation. She wasn't the powerless foundling he had first seen tending a broken relic. She was a queen who had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim her throne. And she was his mate. "Tonight," he said, the words carrying the finality of a royal decree, "we destroy the relic tonight and let the world see what they tried to bury." Her laugh was pure joy, silver bells and starfire, the sound of someone finally, fully embracing who they were meant to be. "Tonight," she agreed, and when she kissed him, her lips tasted like power and promise and the kind of dangerous magic that could reshape kingdoms. Above them, the storm clouds that had been gathering all morning began to spiral with unnatural precision, responding to the surge of ancient power that coursed between them. The choice had been made, the die cast. Tonight, the Wolf Queen would rise again, and every enemy who had celebrated her extinction would learn that some bloodlines were too strong to destroy. But as they stood there in the silver-lit garden, caught between the decision and its execution, neither of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the temple wall and slipped away into the growing darkness. Serafina had always been thorough in her planning, and she had not survived the brutal politics of the Southern Reach by allowing threats to mature unchecked. The Wolf Queen's daughter was planning to break her chains tonight. But her enemies had been preparing for this possibility for 20 years, and they would be ready. They came in the hour before dawn, when darkness was deepest and the temple slept in false security. Lyra sensed them first, shadows moving with too much purpose through the garden paths, the scent of steel and killing intent carried on the pre-dawn wind. Her awakening bloodline sang with danger, every nerve ending alive with the hyper-aware clarity that came from being hunted by predators who knew exactly what they were doing. "Kyle!" She pressed her hand against his shoulder where he dozed beside her in the garden sanctuary, their vigil over the moonfire relic interrupted by exhaustion neither had been willing to acknowledge. "We have company!" His eyes snapped open, pale silver in the starlight, instantly alert with the reflexes of a warrior who had survived a dozen assassination attempts. His hand moved to the sword at his hip as his enhanced senses catalogued the same threats her bloodline had detected, 6 figures, maybe 7, moving through the temple grounds with the fluid precision of professional killers. "Seraphina's clean-up crew," he said grimly, rising to his feet with predatory grace. "She's not waiting to see if we go through with destroying the relic." "Smart of her?" Lyra stood as well, her hand moving instinctively to rest on the cracked crystal that had been her prison for 20 years. The suppression was weaker now, worn thin by the mate bond and her growing awareness of what lay beneath its constraints. Power flickered just below the surface like silver fire waiting to explode. But not smart enough. The first assassin came through the garden entrance like a whisper of death, black-clad and moving with inhuman silence. His blade caught starlight as it arced toward Lyra's throat in a killing stroke designed to end the threat before she could react. He never saw her move. Instincts older than memory, deeper than training, surged through her bloodline as the Wolf Queen's daughter finally stopped pretending to be helpless. Her hand caught his wrist with strength that should have been impossible for her slight frame, fingers closing like iron bands around bone as power blazed up her arm. The assassin's eyes went wide with shock, then agony, as silver fire raced along his nervous system. He opened his mouth to scream, but the only sound that emerged was a choked gasp before he collapsed, his nervous system overloaded by magic he couldn't begin to understand. "One down," Lyra said, her voice eerily calm as power hummed through her veins like a drug. "How many more do you think Seraphina sent?" Kyle's answer came in the form of 3 more shadows converging on their position from different angles, moving with the coordinated precision of killers who had worked together before. His sword sang from its sheath, steel gleaming as he moved to intercept the 2 coming from the left, leaving Lyra to face the one approaching from behind the fountain. This assassin was smarter than the first, keeping his distance as he circled her like a wolf stalking prey. But his caution proved meaningless when her bloodline decided it had been caged long enough. The suppression cracked, not completely, not the total shattering that destroying the relic would bring, but enough to let a taste of her true power slip through the barriers. Silver light blazed from her skin, and for a moment she felt it, the vast ancient strength that had made Wolf Queens legendary, magic that could command every wolf in the kingdom, that could call lightning from clear skies, that could burn through steel and stone and mortal flesh with equal ease. The assassin's blade met her bare hand and shattered like glass. His scream echoed through the garden as silver fire consumed him from the inside out, but Lyra barely heard it. She was too focused on the sensation of power flowing through her like a river finally breaking free of its dam. This was what she was meant to be. Not a foundling servant, not a temple keeper, but something far older and infinitely more dangerous. Behind her, she heard the ring of steel on steel as Kyle engaged his attackers, heard his wolf's snarl of fury as he fought to protect his mate. But when she turned to help him, she found him standing over 2 motionless bodies, his sword dark with blood, and his eyes blazing with the satisfaction of a predator who had eliminated threats to his pack. "Is that all of them?" she asked, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt it. A presence watching from the shadows, older and more dangerous than hired killers. The final assassin stepped into the garden's silver-lit clearing, and Lyra's enhanced senses immediately catalogued everything that made him different from the others. The way he moved with absolute silence, as if sound simply chose not to follow him. The complete absence of scent, of heartbeat, of any of the biological markers that should have accompanied a living being. "Shade Wraith," Cale breathed, his voice tight with recognition and something that might have been fear. Seraphina didn't just send assassins, she sent something that's already dead. The creature that had once been human tilted its head with predatory interest, studying Lyra as if she were a puzzle to be solved. When it spoke, its voice was the whisper of wind through graveyards. "Wolf Queen's daughter," it said, and the words carried the weight of ancient malice. "Your mother burned prettily when we caught her. I wonder if you'll scream as beautifully when I peel the skin from your bones." Rage exploded through Lyra's bloodline like molten silver, burning away the last pretense of control she had maintained over her awakening power. This thing had killed her mother, had murdered the last true Wolf Queen, and helped orchestrate 20 years of suppression designed to keep her daughter weak and helpless. The suppression barriers didn't crack this time. They shattered. Power erupted from her like a silver sun, going nova, raw magic that had been contained for 2 decades, finally breaking free in a cascade of starfire and ancient fury. The garden blazed with light that turned night to day, silver flames dancing along her skin as her bloodline awakened with violent joy. Her bones cracked and reformed as her true nature asserted itself, her spine elongating as wolf and human aspects merged into something that was both and neither. Her senses expanded until she could hear every heartbeat in the temple, could smell fear and blood and the metallic tang of supernatural threat. Her hands shifted, fingers becoming claws that gleamed like polished steel, capable of rending flesh or stone with equal ease. The Shade Wraith recoiled, its empty sockets widening as it recognized what stood before it. Not the helpless foundling it had been sent to eliminate, but a Wolf Queen in the first moments of her true awakening. "How impossible!" it hissed. "The suppression should have—" "The suppression is broken," Lyra said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the garden stones ring like bells. "And you killed my mother." She moved faster than thought, silver fire trailing behind her like wings as she crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat. Her claws met the wraith's throat and tore through its supernatural defences as if they were made of paper, ancient magic burning away the dark spells that held its unnatural form together. The creature's scream was the sound of winter dying, of shadows being consumed by dawn. It collapsed into ash and memory, leaving only the scent of sulphur and the echo of justice finally served. Silence fell over the garden, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the wild hammering of her heart. The silver fire was fading now, her partially shifted form settling back toward human as the immediate threat passed. But she could still feel it, the vast well of power that was finally, truly hers. She turned to find Kyle watching her with something that might have been awe, his pale eyes reflecting the last traces of silver light that danced around her like a crown. "The Wolf Queen," he said softly, and there was reverence in his voice, worship and desire and love all tangled together in recognition of what she had become. "Not yet." She looked toward the temple where the moonfire relic waited, the crystal that had been her prison for 20 years and would be her liberation before the night ended. But soon. The suppression was broken but not destroyed. The relic still held chains around her power, still kept her from accessing the full strength of her bloodline. But now she knew what lay beneath those constraints, had tasted the magic that was her birthright, and she would never again pretend to be less than what she was born to be. The Wolf Queen's daughter had awakened. Now it was time for the Wolf Queen herself to rise.